Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph, your host, and I'm coming to you from the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, which we like to call the City of Stories. Love is in the air on this episode as journalist and author PJ Ellis joins us for a chat about writing romantic comedy. PJ covers relationships, pop culture, and LGBTQ+ issues in his journalism, and his writing has appeared in publications including GQ, Teen Vogue, Repeller, Men's Health and MTV. His short fiction has been longlisted for the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. Love and Other Scams was his first novel, and his second novel, We Could Be Heroes, was published in June 2024. This conversation is led by my colleague Caitlin, who spoke to PJ about his novel We Could Be Heroes and its exploration of queer identities and closeted relationships. They also touch on writing different types of relationships, setting novels across multiple timelines, and how to keep your writing lighthearted and funny, even when addressing difficult topics and situations. So I'd say this is the perfect listening for anyone seeking a little summer romance. So without further ado, I will hand over to Caitlin, who is in conversation with writer and journalist PJ Ellis.
Hi PJ, thanks for joining us on The Writing Life today.
Hi Caitlin, it is so lovely to be here, thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about writing romantic comedies, and we're also going to be touching on your romantic comedy, We Could Be Heroes, which was published last month, which I loved, by the way. I really enjoyed reading it.
Oh, thank you.
So if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about the book for those that haven't read it yet and the world that we're in.
Sure, yeah. So We Could Be Heroes follows two characters. The first is Patrick, who is a very famous, strapping, leading man in Hollywood who comes to the UK to film the latest installment in a kind of vast superhero franchise, which will be very familiar to anyone who's been in a cinema in the last, 10 years. And he comes to Birmingham because it's very cheap to film here. And while on a night out with some of his fellow cast and crew, he crosses paths with a local drag queen called Grace, and then later on meets a local bookseller called Will and does not immediately realise that they are one and the same.
Yes. Yeah, I did love that. I loved that there was not one meet cute, but two put in there. It was like...
I love a meet cute, so I was just like, I'm just going to put as many as I can in there.
I loved it. Yeah, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about what inspired you to start writing romantic comedies. Yeah,
so, I mean, well, who doesn't love a rom-com, first of all, right? I think it's sort of this thing that there's always like a headline maybe every 5 years or so of like, oh, the rom-com is back. But I truly don't believe it ever really went away. I think it's a genre that gets often like overlooked or looked down on mostly because it's a genre that is really enjoyed by women and often, written by women. So it's kind of like there's that some lovely double standards there. But also like when times are hard, you just want a story that's going to make you feel good. And I love rom-coms for, I think, a very similar reason to why I love reading like mystery novels or, whodunits or thrillers, in that you enter into a contract with the writer where you're like, here are some characters, and they're going to go through a formula that you are quite familiar with, and there's going to be tricks and sort of twists on the formula that are new, because every single story does something new with the same ingredients. But ultimately, it's the promise that you are going to be very satisfied by the ending. And in a thriller, it's finding out who done it, and in a rom-com, it's okay, these two characters who have been up and down and through the plot are going to end up together, and it's all going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like rom-coms feel like a safe space because it's kind of like, well, everyone has to be sort of happy in the end. Like it has to come to a happy conclusion for the most part.
Absolutely, yeah. You go in with that promise that you're going to get the happy ending, and so I started writing my first romantic comedy, Love and Other Scams, in lockdown, and it was very much a time when I was reading so many rom-coms and just like I needed that escapism. And it is like that complete times are incredibly hard and bizarre, and I was alone in my flat. And I was like, okay, well, I want to be on a beach reading a really light, frothy romance novel, but I can't do that because I'm stuck in my house.
Yes.
write the light, frothy romance novel that I would like to be reading on the beach with a mug. And so that's sort of where it came from. It started as an experiment of like, I love this genre, but I've never tried writing in the genre before because I'd written short stories for years and, done sort of a lot of other kind of genre stuff. But it was my first time being like, actually, like, I'm a real romantic and I love these stories. And yeah, maybe this is something that I can have a lot of fun with.
Yeah. And it's especially like you're writing something that obviously like readers are going to have a lot of fun with as well. Yeah. So in terms of making sure that your readers have fun, how do you write in a way that is funny, that how do you make jokes with your writing, and how do you do that in like a confident way in putting that forward? Because that's quite a lot of pressure.
I think when I first started, I didn't sort of, set out and be like, oh, well, I'm going to be really funny. Because that's quite arrogant. But I think it's one of those, it's kind of a bit of a cliche, but I genuinely believe that if something is fun to write, often that is going to come off the page, on the other end for the reader. Like if you've had a really great time coming up with characters and writing these, often quite sort of far-fetched scenarios, and you're putting kind of that like high spirit into it, I think that really does translate. So before I sort of started writing rom-coms, I'd tried and failed to write a gothic novel.
Oh.
And ultimately it just was not fun to work on. Like every time I would go back to that Word document, I'd be like, like it's just, it's yeah, okay, someone's like sad on a moor, or in a rundown old house, and yeah, that's a grim situation, and I feel grim writing it.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas if something is just like super joyful and funny and light, it's not that isn't to say that you can't go to some darker places and have some kind of harder moments in there. But if it's something that I'm enjoying, and also it's kind of, it keeps you working on it if you're having fun with it, if you're enjoying yourself. And then also, like, I guess when it comes to writing stuff that's funny, I think the more real you make it feel, the funnier it is. Like if you write characters that talk in a way that sounds like believable, I think, readers can really, really connect with that. And then they're already on board when the funny stuff happens.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You actually touched on something that I also wanted to ask you about, which is addressing issues such as things that are happening in queer Britain and around the world, such as the anti-drag protests and things like that. How do you find the balance between writing about serious issues and then also kind of finding the balance in keeping it funny at the same time and keeping it lighthearted?
I mean, when writing about drag queens, it's quite easy because they're able to make a joke of everything. Absolutely. And they're able to poke the fun and find the ridiculous in everything. And I think that queer people in general are quite good at that. I think any marginalized group that's kind of, been under attack is, as a necessity, I suppose, is able to like shake it off and roll their eyes and kind of just like get on with their lives. So yeah, I was very, very keen that when writing the sort of the drag queen storyline, so just as a bit of a preview, basically there are several drag queen characters in the book who do a story time at the local library, and then they start being picketed, and the protests become more and more extreme as this sort of, anti-drag right-wing rhetoric kind of explodes in the culture, which is a very real and very sad thing because it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of like how these people conflate drag queens with trans women and they hate both of them.
Yeah.
And so it was a case of, I guess, like recognizing that this is a thing that happens in real life, but also just because right-wing fundamentalists don't want you to have fun doesn't mean you shouldn't have fun.
Yes.
And so the way in which the drag queens kind of respond to that, I wanted to be incredibly defiantly joyful.
Yes.
And to have those sort of moments that are very, very real, but then to follow it up with something that is funny or romantic or just reminds you that actually like, okay, it doesn't really matter what those people are doing because we're here and we're having a great time.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I really kind of valued that in the story because as much as we kind of wish those issues weren't a thing, it was also good to see how those issues were responded to in the book and how they're being responded to in the real world as well.
Oh, thank you. It's a fun bit of sort of life imitating art and art imitating life, because obviously these things aren't going to be solved and they're not going to go away immediately. But when I started writing the drag storyline, the Queen Nina West had been doxxed after doing a library event. And then as the book was coming out, over a year later, the drag queen from Drag Race UK, Crystal, won a landmark legal case against Lawrence Fox. So it's like, okay, like this is all a nice bit of movement in the right direction.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I loved the drag queens, by the way. The drag queen names were one of my favorite things. I got really excited. I loved Olivia Life, especially. I think that was my favorite one. And Grey's Anatomy, both of them. I was like, this is just incredible. I think coming up with like witty drag queen names in itself is a skill. So
well, thank you very much. I had a lot of fun coming up with this and a lot of help, I have to say, because it's one of those things that like it just makes for a very fun game when you're out with friends.
Yes, yeah, exactly. You kind of spoke a little bit earlier about the formula of a romantic comedy. What is it in particular that you think makes a good romantic comedy work and translate to its audience?
I think even with a really high concept kind of hooky premise that can be quite zany, you know, and you can go as kind of outlandish as you like with a rom-com. I think that will always work as long as the two characters at the center of it, that you're rooting for them to be together.
Yes.
I think what happened, unfortunately, so in like on the movie side of things, you know, the 90s and 2000s were like a golden age of rom-com. Everyone agrees with that. And then sort of they started getting like rushed out and the quality kind of suffered. And it was like often it would lean too hard into the archetypes of she's super uptight and career driven and he's not. And like that's the whole plot. And it's like, well, I mean, what do we know about this woman? Like, why? You know, like I just think when you're lazy in terms of like just putting those characters together, I don't care about them getting together at the end. So yeah, I feel like a character has to feel incredibly real and have those kind of all those different shades to them in order for you, and also just for you to kind of follow them throughout story and for you to be invested not just in their romantic storyline, but in their friendships, in their career, in whatever else is going on in their life and in the story. I think it all starts with character.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think as well, like making them feel real. Like I really felt like these people were real people who were doing these things. Like it felt very real to me. And I was just like, yeah, I was really rooting for them to get together the whole time. I was really rooting for Patrick to be happy the whole time that I was reading it. I was like, please. But yes, yeah. Yeah, you spoke a little bit earlier about the meet cute. I wanted to ask about the essential elements of a meet cute. Obviously, you got to do it twice in this book. But yeah, what do you think are the components that need to go into like a successful meet cute where you really believe there's like an instant spark?
Oh, that is a really good question, because I don't know that I've ever sort of sat down and really thought about it, because I sort of cheated with my first book where the two characters already knew each other. So with We Could Be Heroes, there's a couple of different first meetings. I think what makes for a fun meet cute is like maybe, you know, having one of the characters be completely out of their element.
Yes.
Or on the back foot in some way, you know, so that the other character is meeting them at a kind of a very extreme moment.
Yes.
So in the first kind of chance meeting, we're in a nightclub and Patrick is out of his element because he's in, you know, a gay bar and he's being swarmed by people who've just recognized him. So he's very like, it's an extreme scenario. And he's kind of rescued by a drag queen who kind of spirits him and his friends out of the bar to safety. And then and then I suppose in the second one, it's from the other character, Will's point of view, and he's at work, so he's in his element, but then a movie star walks in and he's immediately thrown off because it's like, oh, well, how do I act? What do I do? There's you know, Captain Kismet is stood in front of me. And so, yeah, I like, even if you have characters who are like super competent and put together and you know, good at what they do and confident, just like throwing them off in one way or another, just to I guess, bring out that vulnerability so that then the other character can see something in them that maybe not everyone else does.
Yes, yeah. And that it really worked. And I kind of liked as well that Patrick for a little while didn't know that it was the same person.
I'm a sucker for like mistaken identity and secret identity and all that kind of, very Shakespeare-y nonsense. I love it.
Yeah, and I think it really worked by obviously making Will a drag queen. In terms of your decision to include the drag scene in your novel, kind of what went into that? Was that a choice that you instantly knew that you wanted to include, or? So
I was quite far into the first draft of the book when I realized actually like this needed to be an element in it. So the way I originally pitched it to my my agent and my editor was very like a Notting Hill, vibe.
Yes, yeah.
With a little bit of, and really leaning into like the superhero side of it. And then I was like, okay, well, there's lots to play with on that side of the story. We like the Marvel universe and the DC universe and all that. Like there's a lot to like dig and have fun with in that kind of larger than life, quite silly world. And just like the silly world of Hollywood as well.
Yes, yeah.
Then when it came to the down to earth kind of like real life, quote unquote, of Will and his friends and his family, it kind of, I was like, well, he needs to be able to like rise up to match this movie star. Like what's his thing? And then as soon as I thought drag queen, I was like, okay, well they both of them have a secret identity, both of them have like a double life. This is perfect. There's so much like masking and mirroring going on. And then the minute I realized that, I was like, that is going to be the thing that makes the story work. And it's kind of mad to me in retrospect to realize that I didn't know that immediately. It's such a big part of the story.
Yeah, it's also so interesting because obviously in some sense people would think that what Will is doing as a drag queen is a lot more low key, but I thought like she's really brave, like going up on stage, and I kind of like that element as well of her being proud to be in drag but also really struggling to sing live. Like I felt like that was a good way to kind of balance Will's character and let us know that he also has insecurities straight off the bat, because instantly I was like, he's so confident and amazing. So it was really good to kind of get underneath that and find out more about him as we went along.
Well, I think that it's so easy to look at, a drag queen who will be standing at like 7 feet tall in heels and think, oh, that is an Amazon, that is a goddess, they are untouchable, because the wig and the makeup and the glamour around it is, it kind of, it makes them these larger than life, like, goddess like figures, and it gives them so much confidence. But ultimately, it is still a person underneath all of that. And I think often, especially, like, you get people in bars who like, they get very handsy with the queens, and they do, I think, sometimes forget that that's a real person. Yeah. And so, just like really constantly reminding the reader that even when Will is sailing through the bar in like a full, wig and gown, it's still a human being in there, and he's still overthinking everything.
Yes.
He's like, I met this guy, he said this thing, I don't know what he means, and
thank God, because that's exactly how I would be as well. So it did really make his character more relatable, because it did feel like he was like overthinking every interaction, and I was like, that's normal, like that's really good to know that he's doing that, especially with like a movie star. Crazy.
But again, like I've been a journalist for 12 years, and every time you meet someone famous, there is that moment where you have to like remind yourself, oh, they're a person, because you think of them in one way, and then when you sit down and talk to them, it's a completely different interaction. So it was kind of, I guess I was kind of doing the same thing with Patrick, where it's like everyone else looks at him like he is this real life action hero, and then when you get his inner monologue, it's a completely different situation.
Yes, yeah. In terms of Patrick and him being an actor, there's kind of elements of it feeling like fan fiction. But obviously, Patrick isn't a real person. I was just wondering if like fan fiction played into any element of like writing the story.
So my original idea for the story, and this kind of didn't work quite as well. So like there's only a little bit of it left in the book, but there is like a fragment of fan fiction in the story that's written by one of the characters.
Yes.
I really wanted to have much more like little extracts of like movie scripts and tabloid articles and fanfic and all that sort of peppering throughout the story. And then every time I did it, it kind of ended up bringing the book dragging to a halt. So we really pared that back. But yeah, I find fan fiction just such like an interesting art form. Yes. Because you've got people creating like book length works for free just because they love it and they do it for the joy of it. And then that's going out and that is being eaten up by a whole community. So you've got this like whole publishing industry that just like where no money is changing hands and people are doing it just because they have this passion. And I love it. I think it's brilliant. I did dabble when I was a teenager.
Nice.
I think it's a great place to kind of start and to hone your craft, because it's like, okay, well, I'm starting with characters where there are these broad archetypes, and then I can dig into this character and make them more how I would like them to be. Yes. And it's a brilliant way of just practicing, like writing, like playing around with plot, playing around with characterization, a lot of the time writing very intense romance and erotica.
Yes, yeah.
I love that, places like AO3 just seem to still be going strong in 2024. That's amazing.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I was a Wattpad girl back in the day. I can't lie. But yeah, I felt that as I was reading it. And yeah, the bit of fan fiction in there really caught me off guard. It was great. But I was like, what is happening now? I was like, but it was great. And it really tied into her character as well as like being someone that was really into the superhero world, which was great as well, because I feel like a lot of people who are into Marvel and Avengers and stuff like that would really connect with this book because of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very careful when kind of coming up with the fictional superhero universe that I had to really do a lot of Googling to be like, okay, there wasn't a superhero called this. Because there's always a million characters in Marvel comics. So like, if you pick a name out of thin air, the likelihood is that there is a character from the 70s that's called that. So I was like, okay, I have to be really, really careful that this is a completely unique, original story within a story. Yeah. And coming up with my own like superhero space opera that only exists in like a couple of pages, but I had to come up with all of it in order for it to work. So there's a lot of work that did not get into the book.
Amazing though, because it really did feel like also that those films that he was working on were also a real thing. Like there was so much backstory to it that there's just so many layers of this book that it must have been so much work. So well done. Thank you.
I mean, it was a lot of fun. I mean, I love fantasy and science fiction as well. So it was really enjoyable to kind of sneak some of that into a mainstream romantic comedy, because like that was kind of a lot of the stuff that I grew up with. And I just, I love that there are like absolutely no limits to what you can do in those. And so it was very fun to be like, there's space fights on this alien planet, but also we're going to a gay bar in Birmingham.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I loved the choice to set it in Birmingham. I was like, I've never been to Birmingham before. And I was like, I want to go to Birmingham. Like it really.
Well, that was kind of the intention. I set my first book in London, and it was very much paying homage to those kind of like Richard Curtis 90s rom-coms. Yeah. And then I love Birmingham. It's not a city that is featured in many epic love stories.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the inspiration also did very much come from Birmingham, because a couple of years ago, Tom Cruise did come here to film the most recent Mission Impossible movie.
Okay.
Which made for a very funny viewing experience where you're like, oh, that's our train station. They're telling you it's Dubai, but it's not. It's fantastic.
I mean, that's a big difference, actually, Dubai and Birmingham.
Just around the corner. But yeah, I love this city, and I think also that whole write what you know thing. It was really enjoyable writing a romance set in a place that I kind of know like the back of my hand, and having locations that are, there are parts of the city that are really, really beautiful. There are parts of the city that are, a little bit run down. And I think having kind of a larger than life, God, I've used that phrase like 5 times now, having an outsized, sweeping epic romance take place against the backdrop of a city that is often a bit of a punchline. I thought it was funny, but also quite sweet.
Yeah, I really, really liked it. I think it's also nice. Like, I feel like London is so often used in rom-coms that it's kind of nice
London
for it to be
York,
set someone else.
Right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I was like, represent for Birmingham. I really liked it. So I don't think that we can talk about writing rom-coms without touching on the common tropes in romance fiction. I wanted to ask you, what is your favourite trope, and how has that tied into your writing?
Oh, that is a very good question. I am a big fan of fake dating.
Yes.
just because, I mean, it's because on the surface, it's so like, oh, you're pretending to be together, but like, you're like in denial about your feelings, really. But like, that's like, you can't go in and be cynical, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting, like whether it's in a movie or a book and you're consuming it as a reader or reviewer, but it's also really, really fun to write because you've got these two characters who've got like, there's just like so many different sets of intentions at play with each other. You know, they're normally dating to try and get the attention of somebody else or to avoid the attention of somebody else.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the first season of Bridgerton, where Daphne is trying to basically get all of these potential suitors off her back. And so the Duke sweeps in and he's like, oh, well, we'll pretend to be a thing for a little while and just, you know, to give you a break. And then over the course of that, obviously they end up that the fake becomes real. And then, but often it's like, oh, I'm gonna pretend to date somebody so that then my ex like wants to get back with me. And then there's always a fun midpoint bit where you realize that all of their obsessive like romantic feelings have kind of switched and they're not thinking about their ex anymore. They're just like really preoccupied with this other person.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, I love that as a kind of a trope and as a beginning for a plot.
Yeah.
So yeah, my first book, Love and Other Scams, is a fake dating story. And it's like, and also it's about con artists. So it's like, what if you are a professional liar and you're pretending to date somebody? Like, how would you ever believe that the other person is like genuine in their feelings? So yeah, I would say that's my favorite one. And then Enemies to Lovers, I think, is an interesting one because it's harder to pull off, believably.
Yes. Yeah.
When it's done well, I really do enjoy it.
Yeah.
What are your favorite tropes?
I think mine is Enemies to Lovers. I think there's just something about it. It just really works. I'm like, I think it's like, you know how people say there's like a fine line between love and hate. That kind of, I feel like it tends to work. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know why she would ever like this man after disliking him for so long. But for the most part, if it's done right, like you said, I'm like, I really tend to enjoy it. Yeah. I
think maybe Enemies to Lovers works better in like either a historical or like a fantasy context where, because like who in real life actually has like an enemy?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think like rivals to lovers would be a more accurate term for a lot of kind of contemporary romance. But yeah, like it's in like a much more heightened world where you are mortal enemies. That's very fun.
I mean, yeah. I feel like for the most part, it just tends to be like lighthearted hatred or like competitiveness, like you said, that's really kind of going on.
Lighthearted hatred is such a fun expression because that immediately made me think of, oh God, which one is it? Much Ado About Nothing?
I love Much Ado About Nothing. Yes, yeah. They do it really well.
They just love like sniping at each other. They just can't resist it. And it's like, okay, but like, why are you so obsessed with this person that you just like, you can't miss a single chance to like get back at them? You know, it's like,
exactly. Genuinely. And then when they're like bringing them up in conversation, I actually saw Much Ado About Nothing at Shakespeare's Globe recently. So yes, it was amazing. But even during that whole thing, I was like, why are you denying this? Like, you literally can't stop thinking about him. Yes, no, I think actually Much Ado About Nothing might be the reason why I like that trope so much.
Oh, I remember studying it. I think it was in like my first year of university. And I was like, oh, you know, Shakespeare, like some of them are good, some of them are not. And I was like, oh, actually, this is like one of the original rom-coms.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So, like Beatrice and Benedict and Lizzie and Darcy.
Yes.
Are like those original, like that kind of insta hate enemies to lovers. I mean, and again, like in the kind of the Regency era of Jane Austen, like again, it makes so much more sense because it's about like social status. And also there's a very fun like reading of Darcy that I read about recently where basically he's very coded as autistic.
Okay, yeah.
Like very, very like reserved, does not like express his emotions like incredibly expressively. And also like, you know, especially in like the first act when they make that horrible first impression on each other, is just like very, very blunt.
Yes,
For a very like a much more like nuanced, I think, reading of those two characters. But that's another fun one where I love retellings of Pride and Prejudice, and it's wild to me just how many there are, and every single time the framework of that story works.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yes. So talking about like wit between characters and stuff, I wanted to talk about writing relationships and kind of how you go into that, like what the process is for you. Like, do you start with one character and then build people around them, or is it you're thinking about the connection first and then building the characters around that?
Oh God, I think I must be a terrible author because I can't remember if I ever think very consciously about that. I think with We Could Be Heroes, I knew what I wanted kind of the basic premise to be. It was,
Yes.
One of them is very closeted and presents as very stereotypically masculine, and the
Yes.
other is very out and proud and has really embraced their feminine side. And so, yeah, there was a lot of stuff in there that I wanted to do about, shame and sort of self-consciousness on both sides. And how does this, very reserved personality bump up against someone that's a lot more outrageous? But obviously that's just sort of like, that's the broad strokes. And then, I think so maybe I started with that. And then I really did dig into, okay, well, but who are these people? Because with Will, I kind of knew fairly early on kind of who he was. I was like, well, he's going to be the anxious overthinker. He's going to be the one that can't stop talking. He's going to be the one that's like always putting his foot in it because he's just like everything kind of is spilling out of him all the time. But because Patrick is so much more buttoned up, he's so like he's in a years long habit of keeping his feelings to himself. That's kind of harder to write because how do you make that interesting? And so it was, like doing a lot of thinking about, okay, well, like what's his background? Like, where did he come from? Like, what was he like growing up? And when did he learn to start putting his feelings all in a box? And once I realized that he was like just a very, very like big, soft, wounded boy underneath it all, that became a lot clearer for me to kind of write him and also to make this wealthy, handsome movie star feel, relatable.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because he really did feel relatable. Like I was like, I understand what he's going through. Like I really feel for him, which you wouldn't expect that from a movie star and stuff like that. You kind of would see yourself as distant from them.
It's always a big ask, isn't it? When you're like, there's a character who's rich and famous and they're like, oh, like I have problems too. And it's like, okay, but our problems are not the same.
Yeah, but I was like, he really does have problems, like bless him. I was like, I really hope like everything ends up okay for him. Yeah, and I did actually want to talk to you about writing like a closeted and a hidden relationship where one person is in the closet, because obviously that can be a common thing in the queer community, and how that kind of ended up with Will kind of ending up going steps backwards because he's trying to hide this big secret. How was it kind of writing that and expressing that in a way where it's like you have a somewhat healthy relationship? Obviously there were moments where it got a little bit rocky between them, but they do have to make sacrifices to be in that relationship.
What's funny is I remember saying years ago, like, I would never write a book about someone being closeted because like how boring, and we're so past that. And then clearly I walked that right back. But I think it's because I have been out since I was in my teens. And so it's not something that I think about often. I'm very, very lucky in that way. But that is not the case for a lot of people, and especially people in public facing careers, whether it's, entertainment or politics or what have you. And it's one of those things where, like if you come out, it's not to say that you can't have a career, but you're probably not going to enjoy the same levels of success as, if you'd stayed in the closet.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was it's kind of a fairy bargain where it's like, okay, well, you can get all the money and the fame and the acclaim that you really wanted, but like there is a deep personal cost. And I wanted it to be clear that it's not Patrick's own, like, it's not self-loathing that keeps him in the closet. It's kind of a deep-seated pragmatism. He's just like, he's very practical. He has this manager who is very, very practical. And it's just a case of, this is how the world works. This is how the industry works. And we've got to play by those rules. And that's kind of a frustration that grows throughout the novel of why are we following other people's rules? But yeah, so I just wanted to make it very, very clear that Patrick, it wasn't like internalized homophobia or anything that led to him doing that. And that made it easier for Will to kind of go along with it. And he signs this non-disclosure agreement so that they can have a secret relationship. And I tried to make that kind of a thing where it's like, well, this is clearly going to be a complication in both of your lives. But for the moment, you've signed an NDA and there's something quite hot about that.
Yes, yeah. And especially like for Patrick, because that he's obviously, in terms of being in relationships, he doesn't have much experience because of his lifestyle and his career. It's kind of like, yeah, sign that NDA. Like, yeah. I was like really like rooting for them. And I was like, no matter what, it's going to work out. Like in my head, I was like, it has to.
Yeah. And it's just, it's like, it's always exciting to have a secret at first.
Yes. Yeah.
Then obviously the longer you have to keep it and the more lies you have to tell, it becomes very quickly not fun at all. And yeah, it's sort of throughout the story, there is like a toll that it takes on Will where he sort of starts making himself slightly less fabulous in a way that his friends will start to notice. And it's like, okay, well, being in love should make you more yourself, not less. And so, yeah, that's kind of a real source of friction for those characters kind of, as we get into the second half.
Yes, yeah. There is a really lovely moment in the book where Will talks about how, in a way, the kind of saying that queer people end up choosing their families and who is close to them. And he talks about how actually it was his sister that chose him and how connected he feels to her is really represented by that. How do you go about writing familial relationships and also friendships?
Well, I think the chosen family is a lovely kind of motif in a lot of queer fiction. So Tales of the City is like one of my favorite series of books of all time. And Armistead Maupin talks a lot about having a biological family, which is the one you're born into, and then the logical family where you just love each other and it just makes sense. And I think that for most, or maybe not most, but a lot of LGBTQ people, it's not an either or. Yeah. Your family becomes this sort of meld of some of the people in your, nuclear family unit and then other people that you've gone out into the world and met yourself. And so, yeah, with Will, he has his best friend Jordan, his friend April, but then also his sister, his stepsister, who they were thrown together due to their parents' divorces, and there's no real blood relation between them, and their parents weren't even together for that long a time, but they just formed this very unique bond.
Yes.
And it's kind of a traditional family bond, and it's also kind of its own thing entirely. And yeah, I wanted him to have a very unconventional family unit in terms of he doesn't really talk to his mum or his dad.
Yes.
But he's got a very, very strong relationship with his stepsister Margot, and then there's these friends who are as close as family, and they all have dinner together, and it's kind of its own thing, just because that felt very honest to me.
Yes, yeah. I really loved his relationship with his sister and with his friends. I think any relationship that is built by watching Next Top Model is just great. So I really was like, yes, I really like this character. Yeah. That was actually one of my favorite elements of the book, was seeing that, and then also seeing how welcomed Patrick felt in that space as well was really lovely, because it was obviously unlike anything that he'd experienced before. So I think you did a really good job of kind of writing those sorts of relationships.
Thank you. That's very, very kind of you. Yeah, I wanted there to be kind of a contrast, I suppose, between Hollywood, where everyone's really lovely to you, but in the fakest way possible, to Will's family, where everyone's a little bit mean to each other, but in a way where there is so much warmth and love right underneath it.
Yeah. Yeah, it really, really worked. I don't think we can talk about We Could Be Heroes without touching on the fact that it is written across two timelines. What inspired you to split the story in that way? Because obviously they both kind of work without it, but it was really interesting to see them come together and see it all tied together as the book went on. So yeah, what inspired you to write across the two timelines?
I think it's really funny that actors are kind of, discouraged from coming out because they won't get the big roles like these superhero characters.
Yes.
But then if you go back into a lot of the artists and writers who helped create these characters, or who wrote really famous runs for these characters, there's a lot of queerness baked into that kind of, comic universe. The X-Men are, an allegory for queer people, for Black people, for any kind of marginalized group. And so, yeah, I wanted to show that in this kind of fictional comic universe, the creators of the character were queer. They're in a lavender marriage in the late 1940s in Brooklyn. And a lot of what they're putting into these stories is inspired by the queer world in which they live. You know, some of the leather imagery and some of the kind of gender non-conforming people they know, like that all informs this kind of fantastical world they're building. And yeah, just to sort of say, like, we've always been here. It's not a new thing.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I really enjoyed that element of it. For some reason, I didn't expect them to be queer as I was reading it. So I was so, like, excited when I realised that was where it was going. I was like, oh, yes, nice.
It's that sort of compulsory heterosexuality or presumed heterosexuality, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They're a married couple, so you might not instantly go to the, they're really gay, but...
Yes. But it worked so well. Like, I was like, of course, like, they would be gay and just in this marriage because it's for the better and presents better to the outside world. Yeah, no, I really, really did love that kind of element of it. I think it really did work that it was split in that way. I think we will end the episode by asking if you have any advice for people wanting to write romantic fiction.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's not groundbreaking advice at all, but just read as much romantic fiction as possible. As we kind of touched on, you know, like, knowing the tropes and knowing what, I think if you have a clear understanding of what you like and what you feel works in a rom-com versus what doesn't, it just gives you a lot more confidence when you start creating a story yourself. So, you know, if you read, and again, it goes back to the fanfic, if you read a book and often they'll be like, you're like, oh, I really, really enjoyed that, but there's this one little thing that I didn't quite work for me. And it's a game that my friends and I often play where we're like, okay, well, that film was like a solid B+. How do we fix it? How do we turn it into an A? And we kind of just like bounce ideas back and forth of basically writing fan fiction of like, well, this is what should have happened.
Yeah.
I think that's a really fun place to then start from in terms of just thinking about like character and structure. So yeah, like consume as much as possible and then just, yeah, like don't be afraid of the blank page. Just like get started. The first thing you write will likely be not very good at all, but at least when you've got something on the page that is not very good, then you can work on it until it's slightly less not very good. You know, and it's like, it's that just like chipping away and yeah, like don't be afraid of a bad first draft because the second draft will be slightly better and then slightly better and slightly better. And just the more you do it and the longer you do it, you're just going to get better. So yeah, just like consume and do as much as possible, which is not very articulate advice, but it's kind of that's the advice that I keep. It's the advice that I keep hearing from other writers, and I think it really, really works. So yeah, just like we do this because we love it. We love stories, and so just kind of jump right in, I guess.
A big thank you to PJ Ellis and Caitlin for their time. And don't forget to check out PJ's novels, Love and Other Scams and We Could Be Heroes. And if you fancy learning a little bit more about the craft of writing romantic fiction, might I recommend you visit the NCW website and check out our online tutored courses under the Academy banner. The brilliant Claire McGowan is hosting an all-encompassing introduction to writing romantic fiction from September this year, which lasts for 12 weeks and is completely online, so you can access it from anywhere in the world. Visit nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk/academy to find out more. As always, if you have any questions or you'd like to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Twitter and Instagram. We're on Facebook, and you can drop us an email at info@nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. We also recommend you sign up to the NCW newsletter by visiting the website. Some people don't know that NCW is a UK registered charity, which means we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on the website today by going to the Support Us page. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, please do tell your friends and consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a 5-star rating and a review, because this does help other people to find us. Thanks again, keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.